Today we're going to talk about that a little bit. As I told you, we're continuing our series around doubt and faith. And specifically what we've been talking about the last few weeks is around our perception of the world, right? When it comes down to your perception of the world and the things that are and the things that you thought should be, we all have perceptions of what our life was going to look like, right? When you were early on, middle school, high school, you had a very clear perception of what maybe was to come next. And you got there and it was different than you thought it was going to be. And you had all of these expectations that were met, and then you had some expectations that were unmet. And when it comes to our faith in particular, if you grew up around church, if you grew up around Christianity, or if you grew up around any sort of religion at all, your perception of God was probably extraordinarily clear when you were young. And then as you progress through middle school or high school or even college, that perception began to get murkier and murkier. And usually it's around unmet expectations that we have around the God of the universe. And this is true for so many different areas of our lives, but especially true when it comes to faith. And so I showed you this quote last week. I want to revisit this again. This quote's from a guy named A.W. Tozer. He's a phenomenal writer, theologian. I love his writing. And he puts into perspective a little bit of what we're talking about here. And so I want to reread this quote to you. He said this. He says, "We tend by a secret law of the soul to move towards our mental image of God. But this is true not only of individual Christian, but of the company of Christians that composes the church." And so what he's saying is this, that this universal sort of law applies individually to each of us, but also collectively to communities and churches and even nations and sometimes even generations, right? That a very specific view of the world and the God that operates in that world, whatever that view is, actually shapes the direction. He goes on and he says this. He says, "Were we able to extract from any man a complete answer to the question, what comes in your mind when you think about God, we might predict with certainty the spiritual future of that man." Now, what Tozer is hitting at and what he's talking about is that your view of God shapes your view of everything else and the lens by which you see the entire world. But the thing that it's kind of missing, and not that it's like off, but it just doesn't give a complete answer for, is that your view of God actually shifts and changes throughout your life. And as it shifts and as it changes and as it moves forward and as you progress in the direction that you're heading in, as it shifts and changes, also the future of your life shifts and changes along the way. And so one of the other quotes that he has in this incredible work is he talks about that view of God. Here's what he says. He says, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." That what comes into your mind when you think about God at whatever stage you are of the shifting and turning and the changing or the expectations that you had or the unmet expectations that you had, whatever comes to your mind when you do that, it actually is almost like this predictor of the direction that you're moving in. So right now, if you were going to be really honest, right, and you don't have to answer this out loud, but what is the view that you have of God? Right, for some of us, you grew up in an environment where God was constantly doing this. He was constantly saying, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. No, you can't date that person. No, you can't have sex. No, you can't do, all of these sorts of things. There's this massive sort of list of things that you could or could not do. And in middle school and high school and college, things just begin to shift and change. And all it was for you was a set of laws and God doing this, right? I had a grandmother who was amazing, but she would always remind me of what might happen if I mess things up. Anybody ever have that grandmother? Yeah? She was incredible. She's like, "I love you so much. Also, if you mess it up, there's this, I was scared. And then she seemed to know everything, which was also a little bit scarier. And the view of God was constantly this. Some of you grew up and you were growing up in a way where you were taught that if you had enough faith or that you believed enough or you could strike up enough, whatever that kind of thing is, then God would do the things that you wanted God to do. And then he would answer your prayers in the way that you thought that a good God should answer those prayers. And your view of God was like that. And if you're really honest, some of you have been trying to figure out what your view of God actually is because of unmet expectations or belief systems that have changed. It's almost like a Jenga thing that got poked and pieces of that fell apart. Now, whatever your view of God is fine right now. But what I think for you have to be very clear about what the God that you're actually talking about is. I put in my notes, I said this way. Our view of God is illuminated in our response to our present circumstances. And this is why it's so important. That whatever life sort of throws at you in the current moment, your view of God is going to shape how you respond to those circumstances. And even if you've never looked at what your current view of God is or you ignore it, it's almost like it gets pulled out of you, especially in moments of suffering or pain or struggle. And what happens sometimes, and this is what I've had a lot of conversations like this, that when that happens and our view of God is sort of dragged out in front of us in difficult times in our lives, what we actually see is something that either I don't think exists or a God who we don't really want to follow anyway. And so this is why you've heard me say over the last 4 weeks over and over again, if you're a follower of Jesus and you've had these questions and you put them in a box and you put them off to the side and you haven't looked at it in a long time, and you move forward in your faith, but your faith is a little bit overly simplistic because of the things that you've ignored. The reason I want so badly for you to open that box is because there will be a set of circumstances likely in your life that forces that box open, and when those things come rushing out, if you haven't looked at it in a long time, it could actually be very difficult for your faith. Or if you're a person who's actively navigating it, right? I think we have to be so open and honest about what we think about the God the universe. And so when it comes to our present circumstances, you have two things you do every single time, and that's this. The things that you see about your present circumstances. And the second thing is how you respond in those moments. Right? So if you're not a follower of Jesus here, or you're kind of on the fringes of faith, just for like a hot second, I'm going to let you off the hook. And so for those of you who are followers of Jesus, I want to tell you this. That at some point along the way, many of us have found ourselves looking at whatever our present circumstances are, looking at the God that we've assumed that we've been serving all along. But we actually, when it comes to our response to those things, have stopped acting as if that God is present or involved in our lives. In fact, I didn't coin this term. A lot of people have used it over the years, but it's almost like practically you can be a follower of Jesus and practically be an atheist at the same time in the ways that you respond to the world. That you can believe all of the right things and still through your actions seemingly assume that God is uninvolved or disconnected with your life or with your circumstances. And some of you have just kind of outright gone, well, I know that I've been responding that way, so I just deconstructed and walked away. And I get that, and if that's you, I want to talk to you as well. Because somewhere at the center point of all of that suffering, pain, frustration, question, curiosity, maturity, walking away from God that doesn't exist, somewhere in the midst of all of that, I think is actually a really beautiful faith. But to get there, many of us have to acknowledge that there's at least categories of our lives where we act like we're practically an atheist. Now, I'm going to give you a really quick, easy way to assume this, right? If you're a follower of Jesus, the way that you kind of know if this is true, I think, is to look at how you pray, right? Or if you pray in some ways. And if you pray, the question that I like to ask people is, when was the last time that you prayed something that was beyond your control? And not beyond your control, and sort of like that you just wish that you won the lottery. I pray that prayer every single time that I go buy one of those gas station tickets for $3. And I always believe that I'm going to win. I'm kidding, I don't do that often. But when there's that category. But like the things that you actually believe that should be different about your life or the life of other people. For those of you who are followers of Jesus, when was the last time that you prayed something that required the God of the universe to actually show up? When was the last time that you engaged in your faith in a way where there was something that had to happen that was beyond the natural sense of your control? When was the last time that you were forced into a situation where you prayed something and you said, God, it's almost like if you're up there, I need you to show up here. And if it's been a long, long, long time where you've either prayed that on your behalf or on behalf of someone else, I want to lean into that. Or if you're in the kind of category of a person who's like, I'm praying that, but the belief part of that just continues to wane as he continues to be silent. I want to talk about that. And so we're going to look at an area of the Bible called Hebrews, and this is one of my favorite parts of the Bible, and if you've never read it before, it's really beautiful picture, I think, of faith and suffering and struggle and what it all sort of looks like and how it all kind of comes together. This area of the Bible was written to a group of people in the midst of kind of this big debate and tension, and the tension was, are you going to lean more into the law, or are you going to lean more into this whole like Christianity and what Jesus was doing and all of this sort of thing, or they would say like followers of the way. So there's this massive massive debate kind of going on. And in the midst of this debate is kind of this sort of underlying kind of thing of where they were feeling suffering, right? A group of people were being persecuted for their faith. And in the midst of this, they're trying to process through, what does this look like? What does it look like to have faith in the midst of persecution, but also not just persecution, in the midst of trying to understand, is it about checking a lot of boxes, keeping all the rules, getting all the laws right, or is it actually around here with believing in who Jesus is and actively pursuing a relationship with him? And there's this massive debate, and undergirding all of it is a group of people who are in the midst of persecution and suffering. And so the writer of Hebrews, he talks about this. He begins to define this, and he says, now faith, and he's going to go on to define it. And if you've been around Christianity or church for a while, you've probably seen these next few words, but he says this. Now faith is the confidence in what we hope for. Which, when you pause long enough to actually dissect this sentence, it feels really weird. I'm confident in something that isn't in existence right now and something that I'm hoping for in the future, right? This would be Alabama last night in the fourth quarter. That was funnier than you gave it credit for. I was pretty proud of that. I was working on that this morning. I was like, yeah. Like, there's a little bit of you where you go like, there's this like hoping for something that feels beyond my grasp, but confident in it. Confident in the circumstances moving through it. He says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for. And he says this, an assurance about what we do not see. Now there's a group of people that read that sentence and go, if you have more faith, if you muster up faith, you're going to get more confidence, and then you're going to find more assurance about the thing that you do not see, and then you're just going to get the thing that you want. But you have to remember that the context of this is to a group of people who were being persecuted and would be continually persecuted. And their suffering wasn't just immediately eliminated. It was in the midst of that suffering that the writer of Hebrews says, look, it's faith is confidence what you hope for, and assurance of what you do not see. The bigger question is, what is the thing that you do not see? And then he says, this is what the ancients were commended for. This is a callback to the early writings of the Jewish faith where there's all of these sort of like, patriarchs of doing these extraordinary things. There's all of these women in the Old Testament, these extraordinary things. And there's a callback to the way that they lived their life and experienced the God of the universe. And it doesn't get around this. It's not a faith that simply says, God, I know that you will, right? Faith that says, I know that you will essentially do the thing that I want you to do, isn't the kind of faith that the writer of Hebrews is talking about. It's not simply looking at the thing and saying, because I think that it should be this way, then it will be that way if I have enough faith. We talked about last week when it comes to suffering, being open-handed and what God might do through your suffering. But at the end of the day, it's not manipulating God to do what I want God to do. That's making God an idol. What this kind of faith is faith that I know that you can do the extraordinary in my midst. Now, my wife is not here, so I get to tell this story, but we're going to keep it in the room. Is that okay with us? Like, I actually mean that. Do not tweet at my wife and say, here's what Patrick said today. But there was a moment, we dated for a long time. And by a long time, I mean like 8 years. So, which I know, it's like, why would it take that long? Yeah. But we got there. And I'll never forget, we had this moment. And again, we went to a Christian school. I was studying Bible and ministry stuff. And so we would get in these debates. And by when I say we would get in these debates, I would usher in a debate that she would say, this is irrelevant and dumb, but let's go ahead and talk about it in your Dodge Caravan. And so we would start talking about these debates, and we would talk about it. And one of the things that we would talk about is this thing right here. In fact, it got so tense we broke up over it one night. Which is Christian school for you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's what you broke up for. Yeah. And we had this big debate over believing that we would know that God will do something versus believing that God could do something. And how do you navigate that in the most difficult parts of our lives? And I'll tell you, the tension point wasn't whether or not either one of us were right. The tension point was the perception of God and ourselves within the relational part of God. Believing that God will do something and that he has to do something to maintain the relationship with you is manipulation. It's the same way that you would do that to somebody else. It's the same ultimatum stuff, which was the second time we broke up, but we'll talk about that. That was, I initiated all of our breakups by screwing up, so that was fun. When we would go like, hey, God, if you don't do this, if you don't do it my way, if X, Y, and Z doesn't happen, then I'm going to walk away. That's all around this camp of, God, I know that you will. But knowing that you can actually stretches our faith and the relationship in the midst of it. And the reason that it does that is because in some ways it takes some of the power out of your hands, even though we're going to talk about in a second what power you do have, but it takes some of the ultimate power out of your hands, and it forces you to answer the bigger question, which is, do you trust your Heavenly Father? Do you trust the God of the universe, both that he is good and that he wants good for you and good for the world? And so when you take this verse out of context, you miss what the writer of Hebrews is actually getting at, which is the next set of things that he talks about. And so the rest of chapter 11 is like, and then there was Abraham, and then a story around him. And then they would just go through list after list after list. And the things that God had promised that was both directly applicable to the individual, but was not fully realized through the individual. Which is why when you get to this passage, it's actually difficult to navigate, because some people use this to say, if you have enough faith, then, but ultimately there's a part of this passage where the writer of Hebrews is going, no, if you have enough faith, then you will see that God is doing something in the midst of you as an individual and collectively in the body of humanity, moving it in the direction that's difficult. At the end of chapter 11, it says this. So he gives this whole list of these like heroes of the faith. It says, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Now, come on, let's be really honest. This is the part where nobody comes back to our church. This is always fun. This is the most feel-good message you'll ever hear, right? It's the better for us that slightly pisses me off, right? And here's why. Because I want better for me. I want better for my kids. I want better for my spouse. I want better for my inner circle and the things that I care about. I don't always care about the next tier or the tier after that or the trajectory of the whole thing. And that's painful and it's humbling and it's difficult and it's the foundation of Christianity. We talked about last week. Christianity is built on a man who died on the cross, who experienced suffering, and then his closest followers, many of them were martyred because there was something bigger that was moving forward in humanity. None of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Or only in the grander story do you have the perspective of the God of the universe that actually becomes more clear. And the real sort of tension point is that sometimes that's not comforting. But this is the God who is, not the idol that many of us have come to serve. And if we're really blunt and we're really honest and we really lay it all on the table, what we have is some version of tunnel vision when it comes to our faith. That my tunnel vision is right in line with what I think should be. Which, if you're here and you've deconstructed because of the suffering thing, I always say to people, if a God who eliminates all the suffering is the God that you're walking away from, you're not walking away from anything other than an idea, because that God doesn't exist. The God is present with us in our suffering, but that tunnel vision of only happening in the things that I think that should happen, that's just not Christianity. Because it's bigger than that, and it's broader than that, and it's more beautiful than that, and it's messier than that. The writer goes on in the next chapter and he says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, which is weird to think about. It's now outside of this sort of like tangible way of seeing the world and surrounded by this collective cloud of witnesses who the writer has said, move through life in the highs and the lows and the pain and the suffering and the good and the bad and all of it, and move through it with the presence of God and surrounded by those people. Let us throw off everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles. The writer pivots so quickly, and I think it's so fascinating, away from all of the belief stuff and in specifically to the way that we respond. Throwing away sin are the things that oftentimes we use to comfort ourselves in suffering because the idol that we actually worship doesn't exist. To throw away all of that sin, all the things that entangle the relational part of God, all that, get really clear on your actions, everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles. And the reason for that is so powerful and so beautiful and yet so difficult to grasp hold of. He says this, he says, and let us run with perseverance. Perseverance, the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Run with perseverance, meaning that it's going to be difficult at times, it'll be painful at times, that life is good, and sometimes life is bad, sometimes things happen to you that are unexplainable, and it's painful, and you want God to take it away, and sometimes he doesn't, and then sometimes he does, and it makes it very confusing. But in the midst of all of the beauty and the mess of life, he focuses in on fixing our eyes on Jesus. Not on everything else, but on the person of Jesus. And I think that's so powerful. And no matter what is happening around us, that we have a center point and an anchor point directly in front of us that's calling us into deeper relationship with him. Now, here's the part that I'm going to be really blunt about. You ready? If you're here and you're in the midst of the suffering stuff, this feels like a really cute sermon by a pastor with a jacket on. You know what I mean? Like it feels like a really cute Instagram post. And I get that. I totally get that. Yeah, we'll do it. So I wasn't going to talk about this, but we'll talk about it. So we did the suffering message last week, right? And then on Monday morning, we have a newborn. And by newborn, 8 weeks. I don't know when you stop saying newborn, but 8 weeks old still feels like he's pretty small, right? And we woke up, he had a cough. We're like, oh, that's a thing. We should get that checked out. We ended up at like urgent care. So we couldn't get to the doctors. We go urgent care. They're like, you know what? We're not even going to look at him. We're going to send you straight to the ER. I'm like, well, that's escalating things quickly. So we end up at the emergency room. And I don't understand all the hierarchy, but there's a couple nurses like, I think he's fine. And then the set of doctors come in, I think he's good. He's going to be fine. And then like the main doctor comes in, you know what I mean? Like the attending physician. I don't know. I'm learning a lot this week. And he shows up, and I'm holding him. I had just FaceTimed Emily. She's in the car with Eleanor. Just FaceTimed Emily. And he was awesome, but he just straight up looks at me and he goes, if that were my kid, I would want them admitted now. I was like, but you didn't hear what the other guy said, right? He was like, we're totally good. It's a cough. I'm like, we're totally fine. And then I was like, no, but the nurse, they were good. He's like, yeah, it's just me. You can do what you want, but I would just say, like, I would admit him now. Which is a weird time to then FaceTime your wife again. Like, real quick, I'm going to need you to come in. And so we traded off, and they put him in the emergency room, and they got him admitted. And we had like a day where it was like, we're just going to watch and see. You know, it was like very like breezy, you know. I think it's fine. Everybody's talking up here a little bit. I think it's fine, you know. And then the next day, it got a lot worse fast. And so we were there all week with him. We got back last night. And I've never seen an 8-week-old like on so many like cords and stuff. I just haven't seen that. And it's different when it's your kid. I mean, you know this too. Like it hits a little different. And so my mother-in-law came into town because mother-in-laws are saints. Am I right? Can I get an amen from the mother-in-laws? Obviously, they're not in the room, but I'll tell you, they're saints. And so we ended up at the hospital doing that for several days. And in the midst of it, what I didn't expect to see was all the other kids that were there and the other families. And we talked to them, we talked to nurses, and we saw things that were extremely painful to see and hard things. And as it got worse for Oliver, it was hard to see that. And it's hard doing that in the midst of doing a suffering message 3 days before. And then it's really hard doing that knowing that you're going to come back 7 days later and talk about that. Because when you're not experiencing uncertainty or pain or whatever, it really does feel like an Instagram post. It's cute. And then when you are, and you're struggling, fixing your eyes on Jesus is either the thing that you lean into or you lean away from. But it's something that you have to at least grapple with. Where is your hope actually from? And what do you do? Now, I'll keep telling you about that story here in just a second. When he says fixing our eyes on faith, and then the second part of this, if we go to the next slide, the pioneer and perfecter of it, gets back to what we talked about last week. That at the cross, we see extraordinary pain, and at the resurrection, we see extraordinary redemption. Which means that when you fix your eyes on Jesus, you're holding both of those things in tandem. And the way that that practically affects your life is the way that you engage with God through it. And so I'll tell you, for us, at the peak of it, when there's 11 doctors in the room, and I don't know how to pronounce what most of them do. The other part is many of them were a lot younger than me, which I guess I'm getting old now, which I'm just bro, I mean, you hit puberty, right? We're good, which is terrible. Because I think I'm 22 still, and I'm not, You're obviously you're not, but that's fine. And I won't forget, and this is probably the bigger moment for us, was the question was going to be, when we started to pray, what were we going to pray? And everything around the prayers that we were going to pray in that moment were both human and difficult and painful and full of hope as well. And all of those things kind of come together. And we were kind of around his little crib thing. I don't know what you call it. And he's hooked up to all this stuff. And I won't forget, we were praying, especially over something that we had broken up to 12 years before, right? And the question is, how do you interact with God in pain? And we just decided this. This is what's hard. It's a decision that we made in that moment and then had to remake, at least I had to remake 11 seconds later. And then 20 seconds after that. And 2 days after that. Is it God? Somebody texted me this too. He's He's yours, and we are yours, and we trust you, and we believe that you have the capacity to do extraordinary things. And we believe that you have the capacity to heal. And we believe that you have the capacity to make this, in some ways, better and okay. Now again, there are people suffering so much more and differently than we did, but at least this week, this was ours. And we stood around and we prayed those prayers. We had to re-pray those prayers. And it really got after the idea of what are we actually confident in? It's the thing that's most precious to you. And if it's a God who you can manipulate to do what you want, some of you are followers of Jesus, and that's okay. And you've gotten really good at pretending like you can, because there hasn't been a time where he hasn't done what you wanted him to do, but there might be. And if there is, then what? And then some of you have prayed that prayer enough, and he hasn't answered in the ways that you wanted to, and you have unmet expectations, and you've just stopped praying the big prayers. And for you, I would also say, you're missing it. Because when Jesus teaches us to pray, he doesn't invite us in to the God of the rules only. He doesn't invite us into the God who just does everything we want. He invites us in to pray, Our Father in heaven. And that's where I would say the complexity of Christianity is that it's actually beautiful and simple, and it goes against what the things we want sometimes are. And that's that God is a good father to us, even if he doesn't answer it the way we think that he should. And God is a good father to us, even if it's difficult. And God is a good father to us, even when he does exactly what we want him to do. And God is a good father to us, even in the midst of suffering and pain. This is what I kind of want to walk away from for us this week, and that's this. You have no idea what God might do. What I hope that you do is choose faith, choose trust, and choose to lean in. And then identify what you're actually leaning into. Not the idol that you can control, but the Father who sits with you and your pain and who sits with you in your questions, and he sits with you in your curiosity, and he sits with you in the beauty and the mess of all of it, and he gives you peace. So the question is kind of like the secondary question for last week is this: what if God answered your prayers the way that you wanted him to? My question is, do you simply get what you want, or do you become more of who he's calling you to be? And those are very different things. Sometimes you can get exactly what you want and not move in the direction of becoming a person whose faith is strengthened. Sometimes you can get what you want and still not be in this beautiful, messy relationship with the God of the universe. What if he actually answered your prayers? What would that do to your prayers? And what would it do to you? So the questions are this: do your prayers reflect the infinite ability of God? Those of you who have put your questions in a box and you practically live your life in this sort of like Christian atheist sort of version of a bubble, do your prayers reflect that the God of the universe has the ability to do what you need him to do? And do you pray that way? Second question is this: do your actions assume that God is both present and able in your circumstances? Do your actions assume that God is both here in the midst of all of it and able to shift it? And do you pray to him in that way? And then the third one is this. And this is probably the most telling and the most difficult one. Do you approach God as a loving father first? Right? Do you approach God as if he's a loving father first? Now, you know this, many of you know this, I grew up without a dad in the home. And so I didn't really have context of this until I had Henry. And I should also say I didn't have Henry, but when Emily had Henry and I was around for that. And now, I won't forget that, and this is constant, and you get this. I love him so much to say yes sometimes, to say no sometimes, and also to let him experience pain sometimes. And sometimes it's for his best, and sometimes it's not. First, for the betterment of the whole family. Sometimes it is uniquely specific to him. Like we were playing catch the other day. If you've ever taught a 5-year-old how to play catch, it's fun. I kept throwing it to the side, and he kept like sort of missing it. Like wasn't doing. I was like, well, I'm just going to throw it straight on, and let's just see if he does it. Father of the year, boom! Like it was great. It like plops him, and he just stares at me like, "What did you do?" I was like, "This is what you did. Sit down, son. Let me teach you a lesson." Like. I love him enough to let the ball hit him sometimes. And from his perspective, that doesn't feel like love, but it will. And then sometimes there's categories, and this is the really hard part, where none of us will have full answers to why God says yes or no or wait. And anybody who stands on stage like this and tells you that there's a perfect answer to that is lying, or they haven't read the text. Sometimes it's just hard. And sometimes it's not your fault. And sometimes it's just you in it. What I know about that is that you being in it is an opportunity for you to see God in a different way and more clearly, and you can grow in your faith in those moments. And what I also know about that, and you know this in your mind, even if your heart's not ready to see it or experience it, is that what comes on the other side of that oftentimes is something that may not be what you want, but through your actions and your submission and your relationship with God becomes this environment where you get to partner with God in creating something that looks different and is still beautiful and impactful and powerful in the world. Something that you'll look back on day and you may not go, you may still go, I still want that thing, but get here and go, but this thing is also beautiful too. But if you simply walk away from all of it because you couldn't control God or God didn't do what you wanted him to do, I think you're missing the God who actually exists. And I want you to experience the God who exists.